British Guiana is one of the very first countries to use postage stamps. Stamps were invented in Great Britain in 1840, and a decade later, British Guiana was one of only 3 countries in the New World to issue stamps. But in 1856, they ran out, and the postmaster had to ask the printer of the newspaper to print a contingency supply of stamps. There were 2 denominations, the 4 cent, which is very rare, but does survive in multiple copies, and the 1 cent. Only one of those has ever been known since this example was first discovered in 1873. It's more than just the rarity, it's the romance that it was printed just 16 years after the first stamp was produced. People expected other examples to turn up, and yet none ever have. In 1873, a 12-year-old Louis Vernon Vaughan found the stamp. He decided to trade it to another stamp collector in British Guiana who had access to some of the more colorful and exciting-looking stamps. It traded hands in the next year, and by 1879 it had found its way into the collection of Philippe Ferrare, who was still considered the greatest stamp collector of all time. This remained the crown jewel of his collection for over 40 years. Count Ferrari was actually an Austrian, but he was living in Paris. When he died, World War I was still ongoing, and his assets were seized by the French government. The French authorities decided to hold an auction and claim that the proceeds were part of the war reparations owed to France by Germany. And the highest price of all of those 22 auctions was the equivalent of $35,000 paid for this very humble-looking stamp from British Guiana. The buyer in the 1922 sale was Arthur Hine. Like Ferrari, he had a passion for stamps, and he commissioned an agent to go after this. Evidently, his bid and the bid of another agent representing another private collector were very close. It's long been speculated that the underbidder was King George V of Great Britain. And in fact, to this very day, the 1 cent 1856 magenta is the only British colonial stamp that's lacking from the Royal Philatelic Collection. Hine died in 1935, and it was expected that the stamp would be consigned with the rest of his collection to a major auction. However, his wife claimed that he had actually given that stamp to her. She held on to it for a few years and exhibited it in 1940 at the New York World's Fair. It may have been seen in the World's Fair by an Australian named Frederick Small. He bought it in 1940 from Mrs. Hine for $45,000. Small decided to consign it for sale in 1970. It set another record, $285,000, and it was purchased by a stamp dealer from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, Irwin Weinberg. Weinberg was very upfront that he had bought the stamp as an investment, and for 10 years he did everything that he could to promote the stamp. He reconsigned it in 1980. It was purchased by John DuPont, an heir to the DuPont fortune, and it went from $285,000 to $935,000. Again, and for the 3rd time, a new record for a single stamp. People have devoted their lives to stamps. For decades, have never had a chance to see and handle the British Guiana.
Let's first talk about the country of Guyana, which, as the stamp has already pointed out, is in South America. Now, even though it is in South America, the Guyanese people associate themselves as Caribbean, even though it's pretty far from the nearest Caribbean country and from the Caribbean Sea. And that's because it was part of the British West Indies as a colony known as British Guiana. Now, I found some stamps issued by British Guiana in 1954, and you can see Queen Elizabeth II's portrait on it. You can also see an overprint stating Guyana Independence 1966. So Guyana becomes independent that year, and we're just using these stamps temporarily because one of the first stamps that they print in 1967 is the stamp that I pulled from the box, bragging about the fact that the world's rarest stamp was issued from that country. There is also a 5-cent version of the stamp that I have here as well. You will easily find great and colorful stamps from Guyana, such as the ones that I have over here, as well as stamps from British Guiana, such as the ones that I showed you earlier. But there's one stamp that you will probably never have, and that is the 1 cent magenta. That is because there is only one known to be in existence. But if you do come across one, we should probably become friends. Do you remember when we were talking about the blue Mauritius last season and how it sold for $1.6 million? Well, hold your hats, folks, because this stamp, the 1 cent magenta, sold for $9.5 million back in 2014. That's the highest price ever associated with a stamp, and is also therefore the most expensive item in the world by weight. Wow! Now, the stamp itself was issued back in 1856, and only a small batch was printed. That's because the country was expecting a shipment of stamps that had not yet arrived. So the postmaster instructed for these stamps to be printed. Now, this picture is actually a very clear image of what the 1 cent magenta looks like. And you can see that it's black ink on magenta paper. The 4 corners are clipped, making it an octagonal shape, and in the center is a 3-mast sailing ship. There's also the Latin term damus appetimus que vicisium. Excuse my Latin pronunciation, but that was their motto: we give and expect in return. Now, there were some other varieties, a 4 cent magenta and a 4 cent blue, but this is the only surviving 1 cent magenta that is known to exist. Also, the postmaster instructed all the postal clerks to sign the stamps. This is to prevent fraud, and that's that signature right there. It was originally found by a Scottish boy living in South America back in 1873. He sold it for a few shillings, and it has since then been in the hands of some very famous collectors. Right now it's currently owned by Stuart Weitzman, the famous shoe designer, but before him was John DuPont, who committed murder and died in prison. Another famous personality was Arthur Hind, whom it is believed actually found a second 1 cent magenta. He bought it from a gentleman for a large sum of money, and in one move lit his cigar and the stamp with the same match. All this so that he can still own the only 1 cent magenta. That's unbelievable. Now, if you want to read further about the stamp and the several personalities that owned it, you got to check out this book. It's the 1 cent magenta by James Barron. It takes a fascinating look at the full life story of this expensive piece of paper.